Hey, while I'm doing this, can you go next door and set the mechanics on fire? That would. No, it's like a little prank war we have going. Trust me. Go ahead. All right. 2, 3, 4. Beady ta 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 da 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 da. Beat it bop doop bop beep bop. It's Wednesday. Bleh. Hi, comic books are fun. Picks of the week. Ba-da, ba-da, ba-hoo. So, hi, I'm Jimmy. Oh, you saw the sign already. You guys are like Ace of Base. Whoa, what? Because you saw the sign. That was a reference to anyone who was in the 10th grade in 1992. Oh, it's comics. So, um, it was a pretty decent week. Like, I got a good stack of books, but they're all books that I've already kind of babbled about. So, I only picked two for this week, and they were kind of outliers. First one, actually, I'll do this one first. First one is this is actually a free book that I got today. This is what democracy looks like, a graphic guide to governance. Right? Now's the time for Civics 101, if ever there was one. This is put out in conjunction with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. And thank you for noticing that I have to look at through the bottoms of my glasses and I make this face now. Uh, you can download this comic book for free at cartoonstudies.org/democracy. It's put together by Dan Knott and James Sturm, and it looks like as though it was like, several writers, because there's a lot of very useful and apparently accurate. I mean, it looks, it doesn't look like propaganda from either side, as they say. So I just thought it was interesting. Oh, and James Sturm, because I knew him from, he had like an indie book in the late 90s, early 2000s. I also often confuse James Sturm for James Kolchaka. Their names sound very similar, their last names. So that's that one. And then I also got this week, I got Bad Mother, #1, obviously. This is from the AWA, which stands for Artists Wrestle with Apathy, and it's drawn by Mike Deodato Jr., which alone would be a draw, as would the Tim Bradstreet cover, El Cajon, California's own Tim Bradstreet. Pretty sure we lived in the same neighborhood. We're close personal friends. But it's written by Krista Faust, who I actually am close personal friends with. Well, not very close. We haven't talked in a long time. But Krista Faust is a very talented writer, and she wrote... Oh, I think I actually have one of her books right here. This is one of her. This is Chokehold. This is the follow-up to Money Shot, which was her first hard case crime novel. I don't know why they made this one slightly larger, because all the other hard case books were pocket paperback size. But regardless, Krista is a delight. I haven't seen her or talked to her in like 8 years. But back when I was trying to be a novelist instead of a half-assed comedian, I used to, see her at conventions and stuff all the time, and she's a real peach. So, and just extremely talented. So, the last comic book she wrote was with another writer I am friends with but haven't talked to in almost a decade, Gary Phillips. Her and Gary Phillips did a comic book for the Hard Case Crime imprint. Like, Hard Case Crime publishes crime novels, but they also started printing comic books a few years ago in conjunction with Titan, who was another publisher of mostly fiction, but they got into comic books around the same time as Hard Case, which is a little over a decade ago, I want to say. What was the name of that book? It was Gary Phillips and Krista Faust, and it took place in New York in Times Square in the 70s, like, Taxi Driver Times Square. Or maybe it was in the 80s, but regardless, it was before Times Square got cleaned up. And, I can't remember the name of it. But anything you see Krista Faust's name on, that is a name you can trust. All right, that was Picks of the Week. Ba-da-ba-dee-ba-da. Got a lot of reading done. Da-da-dee-da. Okay. Yeah, I took the week off this week. So I've been getting some... It's never enough, but I've been getting some reading in. But first we'll go over last week's. First up, I had these two, Last Song 1 and 2. I was telling you this last week that Holly here is a regular at the comic shop, and I'd heard her and Warren talking about this book, so I said, give me a piece of that action. And said action was given to me in pieces, in fact. It's a good book. It's about a punk band, or like, more of like a rock band, I guess. They're not really the bass, it doesn't matter. It's about a band in Los Angeles in the late 80s, early 90s, trying to make it big. Maybe the mid 90s, which all very relatable. Anytime there's because I've been in several bands, it's not a big deal. I have an AC/DC t-shirt from 30 years ago that I'm wearing. So yeah, it's really good stuff. I almost, as I was reading, I was like, man, I kind of wish I would have rated on the trade. But I have a feeling like reading between issues 1 and 2, and I think there was like a year in between, which is not unusual with an independent publisher. It doesn't seem like I'll forget too much of what's happening by the time the third issue comes out, but, why take a chance is what I always say. I also read Lost Soldiers this last week by Ales Kot and Luca Casalanguida. What's the matter for you? Well, now I'm just being racist. This was, in fact, a Vietnam story, as I was delighted to find. Although, to be quite honest with you now, I don't remember much. It wasn't that it wasn't good. It's that I'm on vacation. And so I'm not remembering much of it, if you follow me. But yeah, it was really good. I mean, this was probably the highlight of the ones that I picked last week. This is Hedra #1. This is a magazine-sized book by Jesse Lonergan, whose name I recognized last week, but I was like, I don't know where from. And then looking at his stuff, I think there was only one book of his that I'd ever read. And I'm not even 100% sure on that. But as I thought last week, it was a very kind of Matt Kinty. Oh, actually, it reminded me more of like Chris Ware stuff. Chris Ware does the Acme Novelty Library. That's his main title. And the Rusty Brown stories, which were collected last year or the year before. I got my hands on them last year or the year before. And like Chris Ware's stuff is extremely depressing, but it's also really good. And one of the characters in Rusty Brown was an aspiring science fiction writer in the 60s. And so one of that character's stories figures largely in the overall story, but it was like a really good 60s short story, like that Silver Age type. Chris Ware is really good at that. In the same way that Jesse Lonergan is good at it. It's a little bit different. It's not, contextually in the 60s, but it has that vibe, a lot of rockets and stuff like that. Not hard science fiction, which I don't care for, as it turns out. There's also no dialogue in this book, which is also a fun thing, which I also kind of gathered, because if you see, the cover is a very effective cover because it looks nice, but also it's basically the first page. Like, these are panels, you're supposed to read it. Brian Bolland used to do a lot of shit like that, especially when he was writing stuff, or he was doing stuff with Alan Moore. I'm thinking specifically of The Killing Joke, especially because I don't think Brian Bolland and Alan Moore ever worked together again after that. Did they? I don't think so. They might have worked together before that, I think, in England, but nothing over here. Anyway, good book. Recommend it. I also, this weekend, I got to read these bad boys. This is the Flash 80-page giant. This is the first 4 from this last year. And they were great, man. I haven't read a whole lot of Flash comics, like, ever. I never watched the show, this one, or the crappy 90s one. I do like the character, and whenever he pops up in other stuff that I do read, I'm always fine with it. But I hadn't, and then also, plus in that Villains one-shot, the 80-page or 100-page giant they did for the Villains, Reverse Flash also got a story in that. He figures largely into this. And it's also cool because the first story is kind of serialized, and they're all by Gail Simone, who's a tremendous writer. And then the second story, I want to say, is all by the same guy. And then they reprint, like, the Green Arrow, like, the first Rebirth arc, which is fine, I guess. But, I mean, it's like, I was going to buy those trades, but now I don't have to for a while. And Gorilla Grodd. I've forgotten how much I like Gorilla Grodd as a character, because I don't really read that many DCs. I like monkey characters, though, so I don't know. I'm funny that way. I also, just this morning, read, this is the last TKO book that I'm aware of that I need, The 7 Deadly Sins, and as you might gather from the cover, it's very much a Western. And as you also might gather, it's very much a tribute to the Magnificent Seven and Seven Samurai, which are, same movie basically. And holy cow, this is really good. So this is written by Z Chun, who's not, this is his or her first comic book. They also did The Fearsome Dr. Fang. Just look it up and then stop playing the pronoun game. He is mostly a TV writer. And I hope they're paying him well because he's really good. Or at least he's good at writing comics. And then the artist is Artyom Trakhanov, Ruski fella, who drew Undertow for Image a couple years ago. I think it was a couple years ago. But which I never read. And now I'm going to have to go get it, though, because his art is amazing. There's nothing I can show you here that's, like, particularly... It's very much... it's not flashy, but it very much tells a story. It's very much in the vein of... His art is very... I would put him in the same neighborhood as Eduardo Risso. He's kind of like Eduardo Risso and Chris Mooneyham if they got together. Wow, that's a very good... You may not take that reference at all, but I do. And that's... I watch these more than anyone. Because I have no one to talk about comic books with. So what I'll do is I'll do a bunch of these and then I'll watch them in a row just so I feel like I'm having a conversation with somebody. I'm doing fine. And then also this morning, I read a few issues of the NAM. Speaking of the NAM, these are this was issue number 69 up top, which I just missed somehow. I've been filling in the holes on this. Okay, I'll start over. The NAM is a book that started in 87, and by Larry Hama, who was, especially back then, a very big guy at Marvel. He was one of Jim Shooter's guys, so he had a job at Marvel all through the 80s. But he also was really good. He wrote G.I. Joe for most of its run, which I don't care for, but that's still impressive. He wrote a book called Nth Man that I remember from when I was a kid that may or may not hold up. When I read Larry Hama's stuff now, I kind of go, oh, right, he's kind of a screwball. Larry Hama is very much a rock star. He was kind of like a Hunter Thompson type, but for comic books, which is, kid stuff compared to the actual Hunter S. Thompson, but you take my meaning. Anyway, he pitched this book to Shooter as something other than superheroes. And Shooter was game for it. And it did sell really well, which I was surprised to find out, to be honest with you. Because I remember as a kid thinking, nobody was really reading this book because it wasn't superheroes. I didn't even read it on the reg. But I would pick up, as I got older, I would pick up issues here and there. Just because it was also, it's a good book, and I'm into Vietnam War stuff. But I guess that's it. It's a good book, and I like Vietnam War stuff. I don't know. Anyway, this is an issue featuring Frank Castle, who would go on to become the Punisher. They did a few of these crossovers. This is much later in the series. This series went on until 94, which I was, again, a little surprised to find, because I didn't think it was selling that well by the end. But, I mean, and Don Lomax, I think. Don Lomax was one of the first writers on the NAM, and he comes back for these final arcs. Not this. This one is written by Chuck Dixon and drawn by Jorge Zafino, who is a genius and who was very underrated back then and who's now dead. But his son, Gerardo, I think I have those right. I might have those backwards, like Gerardo's the father and Jorge's the son. I don't remember. He works, though, and he's great. Very similar to his old man, too. Okay, so then these last few issues here, then. These were written by Don Lomax, who used to do a comic book called The Vietnam Journal. He was a veteran, and I believe Larry Hama was a veteran, too. So he started the Vietnam Journal when he came home just by himself, and Hama was aware of it, and he was like, why don't you come work for Marvel, because we'll pay you better. And it was, as a kid, I liked it, but I was thrown off by how little swearing there was going on, which if you've seen a Vietnam War movie, any of them, that's not really the case. It's not even just the absence of swearing, but the addition of substitute swear words. That it never works. I don't know why they do that. But I am at... Okay, so I need issues. I only need 4 issues of the NAM left. Numbers 80 through 84. My birthday is next August 1st. If you want to get started shopping early. I'll probably have bought those by then. There also had been issues 85 and 86 had been written and drawn already before the book got canceled. So the last issue was 84. They put those last two Punisher stories into a book called The Punisher Invades the Nam: Final Invasion. The Punisher showed up in the 90s, especially in the early 90s when we're talking here, in everything. And even if like there was like an issue of Guardians of the Galaxy where a bunch of characters on the cover were wearing the skull shirt, the skull logo, had nothing to do with this. Frank doesn't even show up in the story, but like back then, if you could put Wolverine, the Ghost Rider, or the Punisher into your book that wasn't selling very well, that would knock sales back up. Just we didn't know any better back then. So more than a couple times, the Punisher, that final story, I think it was the third The Nam story with Frank Castle in it, and they're not bad. I've read them. I just don't own all of them. They're good. I think Chuck Dixon wrote all of them, and he's always been one of my favorites, especially for war stories. But at the same time, there's already a definitive, well, not already, in the early 2000s, Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson did what I would consider the definitive Frank Castle in Vietnam story called Born, and it calls back to none of this. He doesn't even have the same. That's the other thing too, comics, how they are. So even though it wasn't a superhero book and they were really going for accuracy, I mean, he's captain in some of these stories, he's lieutenant in some others, he's a grunt in these ones over here. So I'm sure there was a point to this. That's about it for today. I gotta go. I really gotta read some more comic books right now, but you've been watching the show, and I'll see you next. Did you go do it? Did you? Let me smell your fingers. No, I want to make sure there's gasoline on. Why are you so gross?